By some grace of God, I was the eldest child, and I had nearby cousins, but some of them were much older and the others were younger, so I was never the recipient of hand-me-downs, even though I'm sure my mother would have been grateful. I'm not sure, do you have memories of hand-me-downs when you were growing up? This morning's story about Samuel, which Joan read for us, is not one of hand-me-downs. Indeed, his mother, Hannah, the text curiously notes, made him a new little robe and took it to him every year. Hannah had been childless and offered her first child back to God, which is how Samuel ended up in the temple priesthood. But the robe delivery is sufficiently unusual for inclusion in this sacred text that, honestly, to my surprise, there was a rather large academic debate about this robe, ranging from the belief that it was an ornate priestly gown she made to a gift of everyday clothing. And what makes most sense to me is that Hannah made Samuel something that he could just wear around the temple every day. And as a growing boy, he needed a larger one every year. These were a pair of jeans and t-shirt, not a Moor's suit. Samuel wore, though you heard in the text, the official sign of a priest in Israel, the cloth ephod, kind of a vest, if you like. But what I'm sure, like any kid, he really needed was something practical, something ready to wear. And hence, Hannah made a little robe and brought it to his home in the temple. Sandra told me, my wife, that every year her grandmother made a pair of pajamas or a robe for her and for each of her 3 brothers. Now that is devotion, but a wonderful gift. And it had me thinking, are there pieces of clothing that we have that our mothers made for us which remain maybe in our hearts or our minds or somewhere in storage? Sandra remarkably told me she has a sweater and a scarf which her mother knit for her some 20 years ago. When George Marr was at Riverside United, and possibly later, I remember him telling us at Ottawa Presbytery how each spring he went back to Scotland to plant his mother's garden. And then each fall he returned to take the garden out. We always teased George that he was just keeping his accent in shape. But it had me thinking of that moment each spring and each fall, long after the long journey, when his mother opened the door and she and George greeted each other. Maybe you've had those moments with a parent over all the years. I've been pondering that moment each year when Hannah and her husband Elkanah came up to the temple to make their yearly sacrifice, and she would greet her beloved son Samuel. What that moment must have been like. Hannah had given him as a gift to God, but did that moment ask her, should I have done this? Did I do the right thing? What will become of this child without his mother? And did she lie awake some nights asking those same questions, like all parents when we worry about our children? Hannah had this painful option of simply leaving Samuel at the temple door and walking away, and sometimes we have to do that. But she chose to bring him a little robe each year, to meet his eyes, to find out how he was doing, to watch him grow, and to tell him again how much he was loved. That yearly reunion and separation are unwritten in this morning's text. But surely they had to be a large part of this tale of Hannah's gift to God's child. The little robe was a symbol of that connection, a symbol of that relationship between a mother and her child, which truly transcended the mere feel of the fabric. What we have in one little robe is all that love that Hannah possessed for her child. The love which from his birth bound her to him and bound her to God. She loved Samuel because he was such an amazing gift in her life. And she loved God so much, she was ready to give Samuel to God's service. And that little robe, every year, was a reminder of such incredible love. Somewhere along the line in Sunday school or perhaps vacation Bible school, I learned the old gospel song, "All God's Children Got a Robe." I've got a robe, you've got a robe, all God's children got a robe. But the harsh, and here's the tragic reality in our world today, is I think the song is wrong. The one stat which caught my eye this week beyond the COVID numbers was a New York Times report that 80% of the 30,000 children in Haiti orphanages have one living parent. It's no surprise what Haiti is experiencing, some of the most devastating destruction and poverty in the world, that 24,000 parents put their child or their children in an orphanage because as bad as life is in the orphanage, it's better than the living conditions those children had at home in Haiti. The pandemic has been incredibly hard on our children. Eating disorders have skyrocketed. Hospitals and therapists are overwhelmed. Depression from the social isolation in those early stages of the pandemic and all of the attendant realities have left our children reeling. And the chaos in our schools, opening, closing, isolating, have disrupted that stable state, that known reality which children thrive on. And here in Canada, we have become aware of the abuse which was foisted on Indigenous children and their families in the residential and day schools. We treated them as not much more than chattel, and we didn't even let the Hannahs of the day bring their child a new robe each year. Jonathan Petrie, who died 3.5 years ago after a courageous struggle with a genetic disorder which caused both internal and external blistering, and who himself became such an advocate for others with that disorder, and who along the way found a place in all of our hearts, had the most amazing mother in Tina Bolo, who sat by his side through every treatment, through every turn in his all too short life. And she remains an advocate for other children. Surely Hannah left Samuel each year with tears in her eyes. The sadness of leaving him in the temple, even if it was in God's service, must have been for her a painful calling, a difficult act of love. And yet she gave this gift as she believed that she had been given a gift. Hannah gave Samuel to God in the temple service, and in turn, the temple gave the adult Samuel to the nation. And in leading that nation that was so fragile at that moment, he brought new stability. And indeed, he brought a new identity to a people who had been living through upheaval, equal to any pandemic. Hannah was the one who had to walk away every year and leave that little robe with Samuel, tears in her eyes, a pain in her heart. And it's so hard to live that simple truth, that our children are not our own. They're always a gift from God, and our task is forever to give them the wings that they need to live fully and completely on their own. in my mind, I have no doubt that whenever Samuel put on that new little robe each year, he felt the love flowing from the fabric. And on those days when he was lost and at sea and missed his mother the most, the love that she had sewn into the robe, I'm sure, kept his heart warm. How can we ever say to our children, our grandchildren, our nieces, our nephews, that we love you so that it remains with them? And Hannah found a way. Each year she sat in her chair by the fire and she sewed a bundle of love into a little robe. And she took it to the temple for God's child Samuel. And he knew each year, even in the service of God, that he was surrounded by the love of his mother. Thanks be to God. Amen.